Conference Chair Sid Chowdhury to introduce our next session. Sid?
Hello, I hope you are having a great time. You are all in for a treat. We are now moving to the global economy. It is my honor and privilege to introduce two icons in their respective industries. Raj Singh, who was first somebody who inspired me, then became my mentor, and now a friend. And David Rubenstein, who, including me, have inspired countless of people with his success, leadership, and philanthropic initiative. Raj Singh is an electrical engineer. He graduated from IIT Kanpur, received his master's from University of Maine, and doctorate from SMU. His board service includes being an overseer at Penn Engineering College, a board member for many years in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and an emeritus member of Johns Hopkins University and medical boards. His commercial careers include serving as a chairman and CEO of Telecom Ventures for the last 20 years, where together with his wife Neera Singh, who is also with us today, has participated in 30-plus startups in many different countries. Raj has been a recipient of the Ellis Island Medal and has been inducted in the Wireless History Foundation Hall of Fame. For those of you who are from the DC area and associated with the global economy, David Rubenstein needs no introduction, co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group. Established in 1987, Carlyle manages a very measly $382 billion around the globe. He's a graduate of Duke University and University of Chicago Law School. He's the chairman of the boards of John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, the Council on Foreign Relations, the National Gallery of Art, the Economic Club of Washington, the University of Chicago, a trustee of the World Economic Forum, and a director of the American Academy of Arts and Science, among other board seats. What he's also very known for is he's the original signer of the Giving Pledge, the host of the David Rubenstein Show, Bloomberg Wealth with David Rubenstein, and the iconic America are symbols and stories with David Rubenstein, and the author of The American Story, How You Can Lead the American Experiment and How to Invest. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Raj Singh and David Rubenstein.
Thank you. Well, friends, we are, you guys can hear me, right? So let's welcome David. And just to tell you guys that about 35 years ago, David and his colleagues, Bill Conway and Carlyle friends, invested in our first company. And at that time, we had just started, my wife Neera, who's here today, just started the company. And since then, we have helped start or started 30 other companies. So that's called the force multiplier. David,
well,
thank you.
If I had not invested in anything else, but just invested in your companies and stopped investing in Carlyle, we just invest in your companies, we'd be better off. That was our mistake. We should have put all our money into your companies.
Well, David is very kind, but it's an incredible story about his own growing up. David grew up in Baltimore area, and his father dropped out of high school, I think, and went to World War II, and then worked all his life in post office. So David, that's an incredible American story. What made you successful?
Well, I mean, many of you who have grown up in modest circumstances, at the time you're growing up in them, you say, why can't I have some more money like some wealthier friends of mine? But in truth, you're better off to grow up in modest circumstances and have to strive for things, because the people that change the world are not people that grew up in the wealthiest circumstances. The people that have privileges when they grow up, they're not the ones that change the world. The world is changed by, and certainly in the business world, by people who are in modest circumstances. Because when you have modest circumstances, you know you've got to make it on your own. So I've said the hardest thing in the world to do probably is to be happy. Personal happiness is the most elusive thing in life. If you can figure out how to achieve that, you're very lucky. The second hardest thing is to raise children. The third hardest, who are happy and healthy. That's very hard. All of you probably know that. But raising children when you have a lot of money, that's very difficult. So if you are a child of a very wealthy family, people are going to think that you are going to be successful, and they're going to basically not give you credit for what you might achieve. But if you work from the bottom, if you come from something very modest, as I did, and you work up, you can get a sense of achievement that's much greater than you're going to get if your father or mother handed you something. So I was very lucky. At the time, I didn't realize I was lucky, but I worked hard. My parents did not graduate from college or high school, and I was their only child, and so they put their energy into me, and I got lucky.
Well, I really do think, David, it was a little bit more than luck. I have seen you work. You are a tireless worker. You work day and night, and you are brilliant. So I think there's luck, of course, but it had to be your hard work.
Well, my general view is I'm not as smart as many of the people that I ran into in high school or college or law school. And my theory was, if you work hard, you can overcome the deficiency of not being as smart as other people. So the smartest people in the world aren't usually people running the world, as we have obviously observed many times. The people who are running the world are people that work very hard to get where they are. Some people, you wish they hadn't worked so hard because you wish they weren't there, but there are some people who just work hard, and if you work hard, you're more likely to achieve something than if you don't. And one of the things about working hard is you realize you're going to make mistakes, and you've got to pick yourself up and get back in the fray. Anybody that's achieved anything in the entrepreneurial world know that you've made mistakes. You could have done things better. I made a lot of mistakes at Carlyle, but you got to pick yourself up, get back into the game. And if you just say, I made a mistake and I'm going to go away, then you're never going to achieve anything. Nobody's ever built a great company or achieved anything great without failing first. You've got to learn how to come back from failure. And I made a lot of mistakes at Carlyle, but we overcame some of them.
Well, yeah. David just made few mistakes, and they have $380 billion of assets under management at Carlyle. So I think it'll be nice people make lots of mistakes.
Well, but I could have done better. I made mistakes. I can cite you all the mistakes I made, but we did some things that worked out. And the novelty was that we started in Washington, D.C., and I tried to take advantage of the situation here. So Washington was not a place that was seen as a financial capital. It was obviously seen as a government center. But I was living here, and so I decided if I went to New York to start a buyout firm, nobody would take me seriously because I had no experience in finance. So I decided to kind of do it here and take advantage of the situation by saying I would understand companies heavily affected by the federal government better than the people in New York. Now, that may or may not have been true, but it sounded good. And I remember that there's a famous senator who once said, when you're getting kicked out of town, get out in front and pretend you're leading a parade. Now, what does that mean? That means, take advantage of the situation. We're getting kicked out of town. Well, tell people you're leading a parade. That's why you're leaving town. So I'm telling people we understand companies affected by the federal government better than the guys in New York. And the result was we got a lot of people who were giving us money to invest in companies affected by the federal government. And, of course, most companies are affected by the federal government, so we weren't excluding that many things. Well, we got lucky, and it worked out. And so at the time, building a global private equity firm wasn't something that people thought was really realistic, but we were able to do it.
Excellent. Well, and so moving on to the next thing, which is David is a student of history. He also is watching everything in the world economy and global economy from the front row. So we have since World War II, two models primarily. One is the Western economic model, and the other one is the Chinese economic model. Obviously, the Chinese model had mixed results for the rest of the world. Perhaps really not so good for USA. You think these two models can coexist long term?
Well, there's this phrase that says one size fits all. You probably have heard about it. But the truth is one size doesn't fit all. And different people have different backgrounds and experiences. So the United States economic model has its challenges. And as Winston Churchill famously said about democracy, it's the worst form of government except every other one. Our form of capitalism is probably the worst form of capitalism except for every other one. It tends to work, but it has downsides. For people who are entrepreneurial and work hard and have some luck, you can do very well in the American system. But if you are not that entrepreneurial, you don't have luck, and you don't work that hard, and you may have some problems at birth or other things because of socioeconomic discrimination and so forth, you may be at the bottom. So it's not a perfect system. But for those people that are lucky, work hard, and try to build something, this system is incredible. You can go from very modest circumstances, as I did, to being very wealthy, as many people in this audience probably did as well. The Chinese system probably works better for the Chinese mindset and the Chinese background. I'm not sure the Western capitalism and the way we practice it would work as well in China, but China has its deficiencies too. It obviously leaves a large segment of the population behind a bit. It has government controls and constraints on people. Obviously, if you become too wealthy or famous, the government's not too happy. So there are differences, but you have to give some credit to the Chinese government. When Richard Nixon went to China in 1972, to quote, open China, China and India roughly had the same GDP, roughly $250 billion more or less. Now China has incredible GDP, second biggest in the world. That's because they basically adopted some of the American, I'd say, capitalist models, and they also lifted about 600 to 700 people out of poverty, 600 to 700 million people out of poverty, which is staggering when you think about it, because China was a very, very poor country when Richard Nixon went there. So the Chinese model has worked. It's not perfect. It's worked okay there. Our model has worked better for us. If you ask me which model I prefer, obviously I prefer this model, but I understand why the Chinese system probably wouldn't work so well here, and our American system probably wouldn't work as well in China.
Well, so let's move on. Maybe we'll come back to China. That's topic because it also feeds into our national elections here. Right. Move on to India. Now, over last 2-3 decades, India had made tremendous progress economically and in many other sectors. Likely to be the third largest economy probably in a couple of decades, maybe sooner. Now, we have a lot of problems with China, some real, some imaginary, some political. But what do you think India and USA can do so that those two economies grow in a way where they can coexist for each other's benefit?
Well, India has been an economic miracle as well. India had an enormous amount of poverty. It still has a fair amount of poverty. But I would say in the last 10, 15 years or so, India has demonstrated its enormous capacity for entrepreneurship and for growing the wealth of the country. One of the great strengths of India has been, plus and minuses, it has a lot of talented people who tend to leave the country and come here. So if all the talented people here stayed in India, just imagine India would be bigger than the United States in GDP. But obviously people have the freedom to come here, and they're right to exercise that freedom. India has produced enormous amounts of talented entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley and creators of companies in this country, and I think that's benefited India as well because some of the money has gone back there, and there's some benefits for India. India is the rising giant of the global economic scene, and 100 years from now, it may well be the case that India, or even 50 years from now, India will be by far the biggest economy in the world. It's not clear whether China's demographic problems will keep it from rising economically as much as India will be at a rise economically. But India is the biggest population in the world today, and I suspect at some point in the next 50 years or so will be the biggest economy in the world. And I think Indians who come from India and live in the United States are a major part of our economy now. I think 1/3 of the CEOs in Silicon Valley companies are of Indian background. So India has contributed a lot. Its economic model is different than ours, different than China, but it's obviously had some pluses for India. It's not perfect for sure. When you go to India, you see there's some challenges for sure. But I do think India has made enormous progress in recent years, and it had overcome a lot of the challenges that you saw in previous governments, which were very anti-capitalist. But I think the current government is not anti-capitalist.
No, I think India definitely has a potential, and also I think the kind of frictions we have with China, less likely to be India because India is truly democratic country. So it's the largest democracy.
Look, the challenge between India and China is going to go on for 100 years or 200 years. It's not going away. When you have two gigantic economies and populations next to each other throughout the history of the world, it hasn't been the case that those situations cooperated. So there's always going to be tension and rivalries, and fortunately it's been more peaceful than it could have been in recent years. It's had problems in the past, but I suspect now China recognizes that India is a gigantic rival economically, maybe not yet militarily, but certainly economically. And I think the alliance that the United States has had with India has been helpful to both India and the United States. Clearly, China is not thrilled with it, but I suspect that alliance will probably continue to be reasonably strong.
I hope so. So, David, now moving on closer to home in our own country here, we have elections coming next November, and about a month ago there was the Associated Press and NORC polling where both Democrats, majority of Democrats and majority of Republicans feel if the other side candidate gets elected, that's the end of democracy.
Right.
What do you think?
Well, democracy is, we don't really have a democracy in the United States. We have a representative democracy, a republic, as you could call it. When it was created in really 1787 or so with the Constitution, it was an experiment. Benjamin Franklin said it might last 20 years or so. Thomas Jefferson didn't think it would last even 20 years. It's actually lasted 200 plus years, in part because we've made changes, we've adapted the Constitution and so forth. It's, I don't think democracy is going away, or the representative democracy is going away, but clearly there's a division in the country that is something we haven't seen since the Civil War. During the Civil War, the country basically was fighting over, as not a secret anymore, slavery. And it wasn't so much getting rid of the slavery in the South, but it was that the expansion of slavery in the western states was what the fight was over, because the southern states wanted the states that were the new ones to have slavery in it so that they wouldn't feel overwhelmed if the other states did not have slavery. If the new states did not have slavery, there was a fear in the South that eventually the non-slave states would overwhelm in Congress and other ways the slave states, and slavery would go away. That division led to the Civil War and would end ultimately to the end of slavery. But the division we now have is pretty dramatic. And you think about it, we have red states and we have blue states. When John Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he campaigned in about 40 states, and Richard Nixon campaigned in all 50 states because they weren't sure how each state would go. Now we know exactly how every state's going to go. In the last two presidential elections, 45 states voted the same way each time. 45 states voted the same way, and they'll probably vote the same way this time. There are only 5 states that shifted, and those states are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Those are the 5 states that are at play. So you really have a blue country and a red country, and that has been, I think, the biggest single problem the United States faces today. The biggest geopolitical problem we face is not Russia, Ukraine, not Israel, Gaza, not China, Taiwan, or other problems we talk about in the Middle East. It is the division in the United States. As the famous cartoon said, I've seen the enemy and the enemy's us. If we can't get our act together to run this country better, we are going to not be the leader in the world that we once wanted to be. Woodrow Wilson famously said in World War I, we're going to make the world safe for democracy. What we need to do is make the United States safe for democracy. And, you know, it's a bit of a challenge right now, and the government is dysfunctional. It's a sad situation. You know, members of Congress, and I host a dinner for members of Congress once a month and try to bring Democrats and Republicans together, and I interview a great historian, and members of Congress like it because they rarely ever get together with somebody from the opposite side, so they enjoy it. But the problem we have now is that money has destroyed the economic system or the political system, in the sense that you have to raise a lot of money to get elected, and whoever has the most money usually wins. Whoever has the most money usually scares the other person into not running against them, and then when you leave office you can more or less keep the money. So people raise enormous amounts of money, and you don't raise money by saying, I'm going to do something when I go to Congress by doing something right down the middle that's good for the country, right down the center. You raise your money from the far left and the far right, and that's why members of Congress appeal to the far left and the far right, and it's not a very good situation. So as right now we're facing a revolt among the House Republican leaders and the Freedom Caucus about whether to go ahead with the deal that was cut by the Speaker. And I don't know what will happen. I suspect the deal will go through, but it's a sad situation where you've got the House of Representatives run by essentially the equal size parties in each the Democrat and Republican are roughly the same size, but you don't try to work together very much. It's all or nothing, and it's not a good situation. I worry about it. I don't think democracy will go away as we know it, but I think it's being damaged by the money in politics that we now have, which is so endemic to our system.
So David, I 100% agree. I wish we had a lot of people in middle, because remember, Blue Dog Democrats, there used to be 156 or so in the Congress. Today, Jippo, nobody left. Right. Same thing on the Republican side. So it's a sad situation. However, this topic of global economy, what happens here has a huge impact on the global economy.
Right.
And you obviously, well, not only that you are a student of history, you know Donald Trump and Joe Biden, or President Joe Biden, or former President Trump, both of them really well. You interviewed them, you know them. So tell me, what is the implication to global economy if one guy gets elected or the other guy gets elected?
Well, people often ask me, why don't I run for president? Well, I'm only 74, I'm too young. You need to be older. So when I get some more maturity and I get older, I'm more mature, maybe I'll consider it. But the U.S. economy is roughly a $25 trillion economy, and I don't think one person who's elected president will dramatically change the U.S. economy. It can have some impact for sure around the edges, but the U.S. economy is a juggernaut. It's got enormous amounts of forces pushing it forward. The interesting thing about the U.S. economy, really, despite the division we have in Congress, despite the political back and forth between the Democrats and Republicans, despite COVID, despite all the things we know about in this country, the U.S. economy is zooming past the rest of the world. So, for example, before COVID, the European economy, the EU, had a bigger GDP than the United States. And that's not surprising because there are more people, a lot more people in the EU than there are in the United States. But right now, the United States is roughly at GDP, it's 20% greater than the EU. Why is that? Well, because the entrepreneurial instincts of the United States, the resiliency of the United States economy, the ability of the United States economy, with the help of Congress in some cases, to move forward from COVID has really made the United States an economic juggernaut that is really, I think, surprising everybody, including me. Right now, the European economy is in reasonable shape, but it's obviously not quite recovered from really 07, 08 recession, and also the COVID problems. China is now a bit in slowing down mode. It's not growing at the rate that it would like to grow. So the United States economy is reasonably good, and despite the election, whoever gets elected, and we love to look at the election, it's very fascinating to look at it all the time and to look at who's going to up and who's down. The U.S. economy is such a independent force and so strong that I don't think any politician can completely destroy the U.S. economy, despite their best efforts.
Well, so David, this group here, these are ITians, just like in Star Trek, Klingons or whatever. These are the brightest of the brightest. And so your message to them is, hey, forget the politics. These are entrepreneurs, creators, innovators. What do you tell them?
Well, my message, I guess, is one, if you have children, try to educate them well. Give them a motivation to do something useful with their life. Give them a sense that there's some purpose to life other than just, playing video games or something like that, that there's something more important in life and that you should try to do something with your life that's useful, and that's for all of you as well, but not just your children. What's the purpose of life? Nobody really knows, and we're not going to figure it out today or any time in our lifetime. But presumably, the purpose is to do something useful so that when you get to my age or older, you can look back and say, I did something useful with my life. I made my parents proud by doing something. I made my children proud by doing something. I gave back to my country. I helped philanthropically in some way. The purpose of business is not only to make money, though that obviously has a lot of great impact in society, but presumably the people who make money should give it back to society and help in other ways. Pick something you can do so that you can say, this is what I did that made the world a better place. So when you're my age or older, you can say, this is what I did with my life. Your children, your grandchildren can say some pride in what you did, and they can say, I'm going to try to do the same thing or even more. So otherwise, what's the point of life? Just making money and having more houses and more art and more cars? in the end, it's very boring to do that. You should find something that drives you and something that you can give to your children that motivates them to do something. We don't want children to be motivated only to make more money for no purpose other than having more money. And, you know, some people measure their self-worth as an individual by their net worth, and that's a mistake. You should not measure your self-worth and equate it with your net worth. You should try to do something useful on the time that you're on the face of the earth, which is a relatively short period of time in the grand scan of life. Humans have been on the face of the earth as Homo sapiens for roughly 400,000 years. Relatively short period of time, and the average life expectancy is, anyway, I'd say between 80 and 100 if you're in a Western society. In that short period of time, short period in the grand scan of 400,000 years, you know, you don't have that much time to do something, so don't wait until you're 80 years old to say, I'm going to give back to society. Try to motivate your children and your grandchildren to do something now when they're younger. And you don't have to do everything that I've done or other things people have done. Find something that's your own niche and motivate your children to do something useful, and try to be a role model for your children so they can say, look what my parents did, and I'm going to try to do something similar to what they did to give back to society. That's the motivation thing. That's the great thing about our society.
Well, so David, this group here have no lack of neurons, and now we have AI coming in. What do you think is the implication of AI on global economy?
Well, you know, think back a couple hundred years ago when we started mechanizing plants and we had the Industrial Revolution. People said, oh, the world's going to end with the Industrial Revolution. All the jobs will go away. Well, obviously, when the Internet came along, people said, oh, the world's going to end because there's not going to be any more jobs. The Internet's going to save the need to do certain things. Nobody really knows what AI is going to do. Nobody's that smart. But clearly, it's going to change the world as we know it. But presumably, like other technological inventions of the last several hundred years, it will ultimately create more jobs and different types of jobs. And I think people should figure out how to understand AI and try to figure out how we can use it to make the world a better place. I don't think AI is going to end the world as we know it. Some people say AI is going to ultimately kill all the humans. I'd be surprised if that's going to happen. I suspect that we have bigger problems than AI in terms of killing humans. Global climate change is a bigger problem. And I'd say on climate change, that's a big challenge for the world. Clearly, we all recognize it. It's something that none of us are going to live to see the benefits of all the climate changes that are going on. And I think that climate change is a phrase that we should stop using. We should call it human extinction, because that will get people more motivated to do something about it. Because clearly, if we don't change what we're doing now with the atmosphere, at some point, who knows, 100 years, 200 years, 500 years from now, the Earth won't be able to function as it does today, and humans won't be able to survive as we do today. So that's hard to get people to change their conduct, because people don't change their conduct to help people who are not born yet. So I think we ought to address the human problems that we bring about because of global warming and so forth, but I don't think we can solve that problem. And I think AI will be something that will change the world, but we don't know how it's going to change the world. We just should get educated about it and not be afraid of it. When you're afraid of new technology, I think you run away from the creativity of the human brain, and I think the human brain can figure out how to make AI better than some of the people fear it will be, for sure.
Well, so David, talking of climate change, it's a global problem. We just can't solve it here, but some of the largest polluters are probably China, and India has a huge problem with pollution. And their argument is that, look, this is our turn to pollute the planet because you guys at the Industrial Revolution were ahead of us. How do you reconcile this debate?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I would, I would have been at COP28. I understand the arguments of the emerging markets, India and China, which is the Western world, Europe, United States, polluted the world for 100 years or so. Now it's their chance to pollute. I don't know that's the greatest argument in the world, but I do think we ought to find ways to find better sources of energy for people in China and India than coal. It's going to take some time to do it. I think electric vehicles may not solve all that problem. But it's a problem we've got to address, and I'm glad we have addressed it, but this is a problem that 30 years ago people weren't focused on. It's going to take maybe 20 or 30 years before we can really get serious about solving this problem. Remember, the COP28 standard is to not have the temperature go above certain degrees by the year 2100, not to be more than 4 degrees centigrade above where it would have otherwise been. And I suspect right now we're probably going to be at 1.8, 1.9 unless we do something. So we've made some progress, but it's not going to be as good as our goal of the COP28 standard would be. But they made some progress. But I don't. It's hard for the United States to say to India, don't pollute anymore because it's hurting us in the United States. I don't think that's an easy argument. And clearly, nobody has solved this problem. But we are making some progress.
Yeah, we're making progress, and I think it's kind of, David, don't you think it's unfortunate that there are sources like nuclear energy, and by the way, I have no investment in nuclear energy, that those are a lot more cleaner than coal and,
right,
and petroleum and carbon-based things. Unfortunately, the people had this train, particularly from the left, that nuclear energy is bad. I don't know why. Do you think technology is the answer?
Well, there's always hope that some new technology will come along. Clearly, fusion is something that people think could change the situation, but fusion is not something that's easily achieved. Nuclear does have the downside that if you have a plant that doesn't work, you have nuclear problems, as we've seen in 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, for sure. I do think we should give ourselves a pat on the back for the fact that we've recognized the problem. When Al Gore and others first started talking about climate change, people laughed at them. People laughed. They just said, what are you, crazy? There's no problem. And when I worked in the White House for President Carter, it was not even something we talked about. We didn't think about climate change. At least the world has recognized the problem. We're addressing it, but it's hard to get 8 billion people on the face of the earth to come up with a common solution. So I think we're making some progress. I don't think it's going to be solved, honestly, in the lifetime of everybody here.
So David, talking about Carter administration, at your house, probably about 20 years ago, President Carter, former Carter, and I sat on a sofa with Neera, and he's such a good man. Why can't we have good men running for presidency?
Well, Jimmy Carter is a man who came from very modest circumstances. He ran a brilliant campaign to be elected president of the United States, even though nobody took him that seriously. But unlike many other people who get to be office, he didn't change that much. He didn't care about money. He never cared about money. He didn't care about wealth. He didn't care about the kind of things that many people care about when they often get power and so forth. And he basically, after he lost the election very badly to Ronald Reagan in 1980, he went back to the modest life that he had before. So now for 40 years or so, he's lived a life, up until recently with his wife, where they just try to solve certain global social problems or things like guinea worm or river blindness or democracy around the world without trying to make money from it, without bragging about it. And it's he's a very humble man, a very, I would say, religious person. Those kind of people often aren't attracted to politics. They tend to be attracted to the ministry. And so, the most talented people in the world, well, think about this. Think about this. When this country was started in 1776, we had 3 million people. Out of the 3 million people, 500,000 were slaves. They couldn't be in government. About 1.25 million of the remaining were women, and they weren't allowed in government. 10,000 were Jewish. They couldn't be in government. 500,000 were Christian, non-property-owning people. They couldn't be in government. So you had about 400,000 Christian property-owning men. And out of that, you got George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison. Now we have, in the United States, 350 million people. And what do we have? Where's the George Washingtons? Where's the Thomas Jeffersons? Well, my theory is they all went into private equity. And but we don't have them. We've got to get the talented people out of private equity and into something useful. So I try to tell people in private equity and other areas, look, try to give back to society, and running for office is not the worst thing in the world. Clearly, we don't tend to attract sometimes the best and the brightest in this area, but when you consider it, we have relatively good people. They're well-intentioned. The system doesn't work so well. When people start in our system, they are very well-meaning, but sometimes the system eats them up. I'll give you a good example. In the United States Congress, House of Representatives, 435 members, there are roughly 100 of those members who cannot afford to have a second house, so they live in their office because we won't pay them enough. So we run the risk by not paying our public officials a reasonable salary of things that they shouldn't be doing, living in their offices, but also bribery and so forth, things like that. We should pay our public servants and treat them much better than we do treat them. Singapore has a much better model, for example. They pay their cabinet officers comparable salaries to what they would get in the business world. But we have a reasonably good system in the United States. It's not perfect, and we can change it with a lot of hard work. But I do hope that sometimes more and more people will say, I want to go be Jimmy Carter. I want to go change the world, and I don't care about money, fame, power. I just want to do something useful. And we have some of those people, but we need to get more of them out of private equity and into public service.
So I think we would love to, and I think crowd would agree, we would love to draft you for the presidential
When I
candidate.
age a little bit more, I need to be older. I'm just too young. You know, I'm just inexperienced. I need to get more age. And remember also, when I would work in the White House under President Carter, we got inflation to 19%, and nobody's invited me back since then. So I don't think I'm going to be invited back anytime soon.
Well, at that note, David, we thank you. Thank you for your service to the country and to mankind.
Thank you all. Thanks a lot.
David,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great.